This is my summary and review of the book Jesus and His Enemies by Robert R. Beck, published by Orbis Books on December 14th, 2017. This book mainly analyzes or examines the Gospels in order to use the stories and their perspectives to help us get through the hardships presented to us in today's society. Beck starts by discussing the fact that in later chapters about the Gospels directly, the analysis will be centered more around context rather than the content alone. He then goes into the recent search for the actual historical Jesus and how that has affected the worldview of his teachings. An example of that would be how we discussed in class that there are pictures of Jesus as a black woman and how that has affected people's Christian communities, and because some people would agree or disagree with that picture. I know for myself, I was raised with Jesus as the white male with the long blonde hair, and so the picture of Jesus as a black woman would definitely challenge my beliefs personally. Then the author goes on to discuss all of the ways how we view the Bible is affected, including empire and Judaism studies. After that, he goes on to discuss how the gospel should be viewed as narratives, even though they do break the culturally normal rules of resolution conflict that would normally be presented in a narrative. After the first chapter, the book then goes into directly examining each gospel, starting with Mark, then Matthew, Luke, and ending with John, and then finally a summary of his points. Mark's is the first gospel in the first discussed in the book. Beck starts out by establishing the background for Mark's writing, how his location and genre of writing is still discussed, but it was meant for circulation among early churches because his was the first writing of or story of Jesus's life. So it was meant for early churches and followers. After discussing the background, Beck then confronts Mark's intent to present a two-sided argument of Jesus standing up to the revolutionaries versus his contrast with the basic rules of the Pharisees. The two agendas discussed for this gospel were based around the two geographical locations in Mark's gospel: Galilee, which was Jesus' movement, versus Jerusalem and his Jewish opposition. According to Beck, the core of this gospel is Jesus presented as a Messiah, the son of David. Beck's main point in the discussion of this gospel in the second chapter is social action in the form of nonviolent resistance being the best way to fight today's confrontations or issues. The next gospel discussed is Matthew. His writings came 20 years after Mark and was based off of Mark's narrative. Matthew was a Jewish scholar, and he took Mark's narratives and changed them slightly to represent a different perspective. Through this gospel, Beck views Jesus as an authentic heir of the tradition of King David and Judaism itself through the way that Matthew changes the perspective. He does not know if this representation is literal or metaphorical, but then he goes on to discuss the story's uses or authenticity in either form. At the end of the chapter and his discussion about Mark's gospel, Beck reiterates the legitimacy of using the story metaphorically or physically. The third chapter of the book is about Luke's gospel and his Acts of the Apostles. Based on the author's opinions, the writings of Luke are more about making a way for the Romans to be included in their religion by actually being a part of it rather than just joining their religion with Judaism. Throughout these writings, Luke is especially concerned with keeping things in chronological order, more so than the other Gospels. The other Gospels tell it more as teachings rather than a story. These are more as Jesus' actual life story. Beck also discusses in this chapter how all the Gospels should be taken into consideration together as parts of a whole, rather than as individual stories contrasting each other. The main idea that Beck discusses, or that comes through in Beck's opinions, is that resistance is a lifestyle, and the best way to fight against wrongdoings in today's society is to live a life without those wrongdoings. That would be what you would get out of Luke's gospel. The 5th chapter is about the Gospel of John. I'm sorry. Yes, the 5th chapter is about the Gospel of John. Beck discusses that this is the most different of all the Gospels because it uses a different language, goes in a different order, and starts in a different place. So it's not based on any of the other Gospels. This Gospel is a lot about new beginnings and how they are processed rather than a snap action. In this Gospel, the underlying story is neglected in favor of interpretation of events, so it's less a story and more discussing how the teachings should be interpreted. The main idea that Beck gets from this gospel is that resistance is love, so anyone can change and no person is too far gone. In conclusion of the discussion of all the Gospels, the author concludes that while all the Gospels are different, they are all parts of a whole, as one whole narrative, and that's how they should be viewed. As for my opinion on the book, I got that the thesis of the book is that if we focus on the context rather than just content in the Gospels, as a community we can use the stories as tools for getting through the violence in today's society, with the teachings of nonviolent resistance through Mark, the refusal to interact with in Matthew, the repenting in Luke, and the spreading of love in John. So basically, if we combine all of those teachings and we associate them with the context they were first discussed in, then we can use those stories as tools for getting through the violence that we see today. Like the discussion of gun rights or LGBTQ plus community violence, racism, any violence. I personally think that this thesis is useful because I feel like most people, when they read the Bible, they get stuck more on just the content and what it says and reading it word for word as rules out of a rule book, rather than looking at the Bible as a whole and when it was written, who it was written by, who it was written for, and the context in its entirety. Sorry. I agree with the author's worldview as being good against evil, because when it comes down to it, that really is our answer for everything. A good guy for a bad guy. So as for like school shootings, a lot of people might say that teachers should keep guns in their desks to protect their students. But because they look at a quote from the Bible that says a sword for a sword, and then that's all you need. But if you actually look at what Jesus was teaching through the Gospels, then you would see that nonviolence and love would be the key. So you should be not matching violence with violence. That's not the answer. Personally, this book helped me when it comes to how I view the Bible, because before now, I didn't really go to church or anything growing up, so I didn't really have any prior context to use. I didn't know how to look at the Bible. I didn't know how to use it. But this book, I would say, did help me by giving me tools to use context rather than just the content, because I'll be honest, I didn't really have a great relationship with the Bible because I just didn't understand it. But I think I'm coming into my own with it and how to use it in my life. So, yes, I would recommend the book in that aspect. But in conclusion, the book overall did help me, but I would not personally recommend this book for a class environment because I think that it's too lecture based, and I personally get more out of large group discussions and hearing other people's opinions that would challenge mine, or a question answer style learning environment, just because then I can hear other people's opinions and how they interpreted it rather than just my own. That's it. Thanks.